leave behind the very hierarchical, structured, traditional society that the Buddha lived and taught in, and get up to our own era and a few issues about right livelihood in our own times. Because today we live in a very different time. Most of the jobs that our grandparents did are obsolete. All of my grandparents were coal miners. Nobody much does that anymore. Young people today enter the labour market doing jobs that did not exist when they were born. Many of them will end their careers doing jobs that haven't been invented yet. At the same time, we have labour laws, trade unions, health and safety, equal opportunities, safeguarding. And we've spent the last couple of 100 years having debates about industrial relations, on-the-job training, and the rights of employers and employees. In some countries, like France, for example, labour is quite heavily protected by law. In others, like the United States, it's hardly protected at all. And we can choose our jobs, or we can change them freely. We talk about issues like job satisfaction and work-life balance. In the last few weeks, most of us have learned to work in very new ways. 2 months ago, I'd never heard of Zoom. Now I wish I'd bought shares in it. I have the enjoyment of co-leading, I should say, a little study group on Zoom on a Thursday evening. But some of the people come to the study group and say, I've spent 7 hours on Zoom today. I've got square eyes. I can hardly cope. So we're living in a time when work is changing very, very rapidly indeed. And as a society, we've developed a very strong idea in the last few weeks about who are the key workers whose work we simply cannot do without. We are very much aware of who quite rightly gets clapped on a Thursday evening and why. So it's no wonder that our ideas of right livelihood need to develop and build on what the Buddha taught over 2,000 years ago. And during the 20th century, some Buddhists began to try and do exactly that. I'm just going to quickly mention some ideas from an American Theravadan teacher called Jack Cornfield, and then have a look at our own experience in the Triratna movement. Both developed ideas about right livelihood in the late 20th and early 21st century. Jack Cornfield lists 5 aspects of a modern day right livelihood. Here we go. Avoid work which causes harm, so not harming and actually helping other people. 2, giving you appropriate happiness, the same list of 4 things the Buddha mentioned before. I'll give you it again in a moment. 3, stimulating you to grow and become more ethical. In plain language, treating work itself as a spiritual practice. 4, simplicity. A right livelihood should give you adequate support for a simple life. You don't need the Porsche. And number 5, service, that your livelihood should produce benefit to other people and to society as a whole. And Jack Cornfield's appropriate happiness is the same four happinesses that I mentioned by the Buddha a little while ago. I like the list, so I'll read it again. The happiness of ownership, joy in what you've got. The happiness of enjoyment, joy in using what you've got, spending your earnings to benefit yourself and others. The happiness of being free from debt, joy in being independent. The pleasure of being free from debt and charity and handouts. And 4, the best of the lot, the happiness of blamelessness. Earning your living ethically, leaving you with a clear conscience that you're doing no harm and at least some good. Now I'll go on and say a little bit about our own beloved movement. From the 1970s onwards, what used to be called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order sought to develop right livelihood businesses to offer employment to our own members and supporters. And some of these became very successful for a time at least. They included vegetarian restaurants, a whole food shop, a chain of gift shops, a cafe for festivals, a huge great warehouse supplying the gift shops, as well as teams of staff for retreat centres in the countryside and teams of staff for urban centres like, I was going to say this one, the one we'd all like to be sitting in if we could be at the moment. In addition, last summer I had the pleasure of meeting an Indian order member who's founded 2 primary schools and also a savings bank which operates from the top floor of his house. There are no limits to some people's initiative and ingenuity. Now, there were some straightforward ideas behind those right livelihood businesses. The first was that they gave workers support rather than a salary. The idea was to meet each worker's individual needs. Now, I have to say that the word needs was interpreted rather strictly, and the financial rewards were not large. Second, the work should be ethical and the business run in an ethical way, with people treating each other ethically. Thirdly, Buddhists should work with other Buddhists and so be able to develop spiritual friendship, something our movement's always considered to be very important. And finally, the good old Buddhist principle of generosity. The profits from these businesses should be given away to support other FWBO activities. Now, in practice, this tended to mean businesses run as co-ops or on cooperative lines. The staff often shared the same accommodation, thus living together as well as working together. There was a very strong emphasis on the teamwork aspect, and the teams at the time were almost always single sex, because that was a strong part of FWBO thinking at the time. It's somewhat less so today. The businesses were in what economists know as contestable markets, markets that are easy for new companies to join. And I'm afraid that tends to result in both low profit and low pay. And although many of the workers were graduates, much of the work was quite low skilled. As time went on, it became harder to staff these businesses. Modern day graduates come saddled with high levels of debt and are less willing to do minimum wage work. Vegetarian restaurants and organic groceries were once highly unusual, but have now gone mainstream, and some are run by big chains. And internet trading undercut both the gift shops and the warehouse. I'm happy to say that some right livelihood businesses continue to thrive. Lama's Pajamas in Bethnal Green meets a seemingly inexhaustible demand for vintage clothing. New View Residential in Cambridge meets an equally inexhaustible demand from tenants for ethical landlords and from property owners for ways to earn a rental without ripping their tenants off. It is difficult to start a successful right livelihood business, even harder than starting a local centre like our own North London centre. Today, most of our committed supporters work in conventional employment or self-employment. I'm happy to say that shortly before the lockdown, our friends down the road at the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green held a day event called Build a Buddhist Business. There are several reports and talks from this event online. They're quite easy to Google. There's quite a lot to look at there if you think it's interesting. And I have included a link to a stimulus sheet that they call the Canvas. If you're interested in starting a Buddhist business, with the handout for this talk. Once upon a time, I thought in an old-fashioned kind of way, I'd be able to smile at all of you at the end of the talk and hand out a nice printed piece of paper with stuff on it. I think we'll try and find a way of getting that all online. I hope at least some of you will be interested in that. Phew. Well, in this talk, I've whizzed through quite a lot of ideas about right livelihood, but I think Ratnaprabha likes using these talks to stimulate discussion, so I thought I'd better make sure there was something there. I've tried to show that our right livelihood means much more than just a wage or a salary. It shapes every aspect of our lives. I've tried to show how the Buddha considered right livelihood to be an important aspect of the spiritual life. But in the context of a traditional society, he mostly confined himself to urging people to avoid obviously unethical livelihoods and to urging people to do their very best in whatever livelihood they happen to have been born into. And I've tried to show how modern-day Buddhists have tried to develop the idea of right livelihood so that work becomes a means of personal development rather than just a rather tiresome necessity. It can be all too easy to see the work we do as an irritating nuisance, as something that we're obliged to do when we'd rather be meditating or doing long retreats or something like that. I'd like to finish this talk by countering that view, by offering you a quote by Sangharakshita that I hope you'll find helpful. It comes from a book called Wisdom Beyond Words, which doesn't have an awful lot about work in it, but it's a brilliant book. I definitely recommend it. Anyway, the quote goes like this, quote, "Our everyday life may be pleasurable or painful, wildly ecstatic or unbearably agonizing, or just plain dull and boring much of the time. But it is here, in the midst of all these experiences, good, bad, and indifferent, and nowhere else, that enlightenment is to be attained." I hope that you've heard at least something worthwhile from this talk. Thank you all for listening to me today.
Thank you very much, Kusala, for that. There's been a couple of questions in the chat. Shall I pass them on to you, and anyone else who wants to put one in the chat, and I'll unmute us in a couple of minutes as well.
Okay, Doug.
So Anna was saying that you mentioned that the Buddha didn't do any work, but isn't teaching work?
I suppose really what I meant is that the Buddha, we don't have any records of the Buddha doing what might be conventionally described as work. In Ireland, people used to ask, did they dig turf? No. We don't ever really see the Buddha getting his hands dirty or getting a hold of a shovel or something like that. Although there is a very good story about the Buddha cleaning up a rather distressed sick monk who got dysentery. But I suppose I'm thinking of the contrast between the Christian image of Jesus as a skilled craftsman. The Buddha never, as far as I know, had a conventional job.